Okay. Alors, bon après-midi.
Good afternoon.
We will begin our panel on the public sector and what works in the public sector, policy choices, good practices. Nous avons un panel.
We have a very interesting and diverse panel.
We'll be making presentations and speaking in both official languages of the OECD, en français et en anglais.
Both in French and in English.
Opportunity for you who need, is the interpretation working? Just to make sure.
English on channel 2. Just to check that everything is working, can you hear me? Can you hear the English interpretation? English interpretation, can you hear the English channel? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Ça va donner le temps aux gens de... Ça marche, oui? Non.
Can you hear me on the English channel? Everything seems to be working. Okay.
I am the Canadian ambassador representative to the OECD, and we have a very distinguished panel this afternoon to talk about the measures and what works and the good practices in the public sector in terms of access to leadership, women's access to leadership, and I will do a brief introduction to our panelists. I will begin with just to introduce Monica Kaiser, who is a senior counselor and head of social policy division at the OECD. Dr. Nurayati Ali Assegaf, who is a member of parliament from Indonesia, but that is giving short shrift to her very comprehensive and experienced background, which she can speak to. Rolf Alter, who is our other gender representative, who is the Director of the Public Governance and Territorial Development at the OECD. Agnès Arcier, qui est l'administratrice générale
who is General Administrator for Public Finance in France and works with the Minister of Economy.
The Judicial Appointments Commission in the United Kingdom. And Madame Martine Meheux, qui est la fondatrice et la...
And Martine Meheux, who is founder and president of Women for European Citizenship. Welcome to all.
And welcome to our audience this afternoon. We heard earlier a very interesting panel and on a mix of public and private perspectives on improving women's access to leadership. We heard in that context that the public sector plays a key role, a leadership role, a model for other sectors, and we will have the opportunity to hear from excellent representatives as role models of what kind of role the public sector can play and in what context. I think also of interest to us will be the personal experience of the people on this panel, both in terms of what they have lived, but also what has worked in their particular sectors. And I think the idea here is also to have a discussion on what works in a parliamentary process, what works in a judiciary process, and what works in an NGO or public engagement, and what works in the public sector. And then from an international perspective, hearing about how one influences perhaps international standards and behaviors, and what is an ideal outcome that we should all be striving for. We have, in Canada, as many or some of you may know, we have a new government and a Prime Minister who, without having a quota system, and I'll get back to that in a minute, introduced a gender parity in the cabinet. When asked why, he answered it's 2015, because his cabinet was announced in November 4th, 2015. He would probably give the same answer today, which is it's 2016, it's 2017, et cetera, et cetera. So the reality is that this should no longer be an issue, which is essentially the underlying premise. But why is it still an issue? And one could ask on this day, March 8th, the International Women's Day, why is it still an issue? I think that we have in the public sector in Canada made significant strides. When I look at, for example, in the federal government, 42% of senior executives are women. It is not gender parity, but it is not bad. Our workforce overall in the public service is around 56% of women, but that's at all levels of the organization. Parliamentary representation is not as high, but it is at 26% in the current parliament, the biggest it's ever been of having women representatives. Cabinet I have spoken of. The judiciary is not entirely balanced, but we do have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, which is the highest court, is a woman. And we have other women justices in the Supreme Court. So it is not by any means perfect in Canada. I would never say that, but we are at least on the right track and making significant improvements. One of the things that I have learned from my own experience is I have been the first woman in many positions in government. What I think has always been important for me, but also for the role modeling, is that I should never be the first. The one behind me should be a woman. So the second, the third, the fourth. So then, as Ambassador Serrano said, we are no longer an exotic first, but we are, and women in positions of influence or leadership, it is no longer a special thing. It is a given thing, and it is no longer an exception. I will now turn to our panelists and ask them more specifically what has worked for you and what has worked in your sector. What do you think are the good practices? I would not ask you to say what is the single thing, because I don't think there ever is, but if there is one element in your path, in your own experience, in your own sector, that you have identified that you can think would have made a big difference or a change. Alors je vais demander.
I'm now going to ask the panelists to share with us their experience, what policies really made a difference in their industry or in their own personal life. And if there was one policy that really changed everything, what is that particular policy? What policy changed the landscape?
A few on the parliamentary aspects, and perhaps talk to us about your experience and what has changed, what has worked.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that I really appreciate the OECD for having this, and especially in the celebrating International Women's Day. And I feel honored to be here. And I would really talk about my own experience as to be in this level now, as you said, that to be the first woman in Indonesia who lead 148 members of parliament, to be the first woman in Indonesia who are the vice president in the biggest political party, which have no blood ties with the founder of political. Then, but as you said, that I don't want to be the first, but I should also grab another woman to have the same, to be the first. Like when I was lead 148 MPs, which dominated male, and you know Indonesia is still very patriarchal, and you know that we are majority Muslims, and also we have we are very heterogeneous. I mean that diversity. Then it's not that easy. I have a lot of challenge to be there, and the most important, I think that's we should make a strategic partnership with the men, with the male partners. I mean, we should not work alone because we need them to support us, and we do not want to compete with them. We don't have to compete with our male partners. We should really work hand in hand. I myself always put myself to serve them, to serve my male. Not only saying serving them meaning, but I put them to make them depend on me. Then in that term, we can bargain. So we make them, because woman doesn't have to be. It's still difficult in my country to have this kind of position, but as long as you have the leadership by example, you give them that you are there and you deserve to be there. And then, not alone, you have to take your female friends to be with you. I mean that, so don't be alone. You should grab other people, other female and male, as with you. That's my experience. And, you know, in my country, we do have, in Constitution, our Constitution, we have the same. I mean that before law, man and woman. But that was since 1945, since our independence. But then doesn't change anything. Until we struggle, the woman struggling, because I was also an activist since I was a student. Then we make groups, and then we struggle to get quota 30%. And that start to have more women in parliament. I mean that I joined the political party, Democratic Party, which the president SPY, the 6th president of Indonesia, the president of our political party. Then I also have appointed as the presidential staff to the First Lady as a speechwriter, and the first woman and the only woman. And then when I moved to Parliament, then everybody said, you know that we have 550 parliamentarians. Why you want to move there? And as a special staff to the First Lady, only one, and everybody want to be here. I said, yes, but this is not what I want to do. This is only for myself, not for other women. When I moved to Parliament, and I really take a very, very active role in my political party, then I can take more women. And that's what I keep doing it. So not alone, because some people think that when we are there, very good sitting, you know, they said that, so you don't want to move. I told them, no. If I don't move, then nobody will take my place. So I should move to have a challenge. That's why I said that I really encourage women not to wait until a man asks you to stand for it, but go for it and make sure that you can be there. Don't worry. The goal is you have to be, you give leadership by example. You should be inspired other women that tell them that this is not the end of the world. If you lose, that's it. You have the experience, but you don't have to feel shy. Like in IPU, Interparliamentary Union, which we have 165 member countries. They don't, 127 years of IPU only have one woman president. This is unbelievable. And that's not even elected, but because the vice president and the president was not as a member of parliament anymore, so there's this woman being a president. Then the next election, I challenged a man. I said, I run for the president of IPU. And then I almost get it. Almost, only 7 seats. Yeah, only 7 seats different. And then the second, I told them that as long as IPU don't have woman as a president in IPU, I mean not president of woman parliamentarian, as I was there, but the president of IPU assembly, then I will challenge them. Not because me. I want the woman, not me. The woman all over the world. The woman, it should be you, can be any woman. Doesn't have to be me. But we have to encourage them. That's to be leaders, you have to have courage. Not only courage, but of course, that you have to have knowledge also. Knowledge doesn't have to be you get a PhD or whatever, but you should really encourage yourself to read the rule of law, the rule and procedures in any organization. That's what I'm doing. In my political party now, I'm as the vice president, and I work a lot to encourage other women. Seems like when they talk to me, they said that, Nur Hayati, it's enough. You have, you know, when I was the head of political party, I mean that in the House, I gave more women to sit as the chairperson in the committee. And they said, you as our leaders, you're representing more than 50%. Why you should put more women? They said that. Where are we? I said, no, it's not because we're competing, but I have to give them chances. Women are usually able to do the job, but they don't get the access. So please, my male counterpart, help them. It's not your competitors, but it's your partners. It's really, you need to be with them, and you will be more powerful. Don't think that women will take you away, but they will be with you together, walking alongside with you. I think that's what we should do.
Thank you. There are a lot of very profound experiences in your story and your own evolution, and I think one of them is that be bold. The other one is bring others with you, and encourage others, and use your power to make change, to bring other women along with you. Sur ces questions, peut-être je demanderai maintenant à Martine Meilleux.
So now I would like to ask Martine Meilleux to tell us whether there were also turning points or whether there were role models that helped to induce change, either in the NGOs or in your own evolution. Thank you very much. In my experience, I would like to start by saying that I was a bad student, but I was lucky because our parents always trusted their children, and it's very important because very often women lack confidence, and that's one of the key problems. And then I went to the Collège de l'Europe, and I trained in marketing, and I came back to civil society and worked for an association. And I held the chairmanship for 3 associations, Union Fédérale, and I'm also reserve colonel of the Air Force. And I realized that issues that involve the entire population are often in the hands of a too large a proportion of men. And this is something that was very disturbing to me because I thought that Europe is made as many women as men. I think there are even more than 50% women. And I was always surrounded by men. And that was the reason why, after having had a survey done, which was an extremely informative survey, in which I asked women what they thought of Europe and why they didn't get involved in associations that promoted Europe. And the outcome of the survey was extremely clear. Most of these women answered that it was something very complicated and they didn't understand it, and that's why they didn't get involved. I don't think that men understand Europe much better. I think that Europe is a complicated issue, but I don't see why women would understand it less than men. So that's what decided me as a vice president of the European movement to organize my association. And I would like to add to what have just been said, that I totally agree with you. And why did we set up this association? It's precisely because women have to learn to speak in public, because so long as little girls and young girls are not encouraged to dare to take risks, all the legislation that was discussed earlier, quotas and everything that was put into question, which is necessary, but it will be insufficient. So, with regard to this idea of an association, and I remember that Nathalie Loiseau last year said exactly the same. She was in the École Nationale d'Administration, a high school for civil servants. She mentioned the idea of networking. We have to work with other women. And not only that, because you see that other women dare, you feel emulated, you feel stimulated, and that's exactly it. So we set up this association, which is a citizen cafe for Europe, and we invite European MPs and specialists in European issues. And I think that this model, this role model, is very important. And I'd like to add a third factor, which is as important. Men have to be involved as well. It is essential that men give confidence to women. Women have to acquire confidence, but men have also a role to play by women. And I have observed this all along my commitments and my activism. It's necessary to feel supported by men because they have a very important to play as a support factors.
Judiciary is a sector that we don't often look at in terms of the impact of leadership and role modeling, but also obviously the decision making and the results of the interpretation of law. But how and what approach do you take in the Commission, and what measures have you seen have either changed the outcomes, if they have, or what has had an impact?
Thank you. Thanks. Well, if I can just say a few words to explain what the Judicial Appointments Commission is, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're an independent public body that was set up in April 2006, so just almost 10 years ago, to select judges for courts and tribunals across England and Wales. We have 15 commissioners, including a lay chairman, and we have currently a very good gender balance on the commission itself, so we have 8 men and 7 women, almost perfect. The Commission recommends candidates for all judicial roles up to and including the High Court. We also are involved to a lesser degree in the more senior roles, so the Court of Appeal and the most senior leadership roles, up to the Lord Chief Justice, the head of the judiciary. The JSC has 3 core duties which are set out in statute. So first of all, we have to select solely on merit. That's obviously absolutely key. We have to select only people of good character, and we have to have regard to the need to encourage diversity in the range of people available for selection. I must say that all of our commissioners are fully committed to achieving a more diverse judiciary, and that's for a whole host of reasons. If I can very quickly name a few: democratic legitimacy, equality of opportunity, and the other side of that coin, which is the need to draw from talent from across the whole of society. And in my own view, it's also extremely important to draw on those diverse perspectives, as you've alluded to, in developing the law. I think that is arguably particularly important in a common law jurisdiction such as England and Wales. So the JSC has developed a 3-prong strategy to increase diversity based on what we think has worked for us so far. And it firmly places diversity at the heart of everything that we do. So firstly, we target our outreach or candidate attraction activities at underrepresented groups such as women, but also several other groups as well. Our research into the barriers which prevent people from applying have indicated that something as simple as lack of information about roles, lack of information about judicial careers, what it's like to be a judge, what it involves, have been one of the main barriers for women in particular. So we provide a whole range of information through seminars and webinars and e-newsletters, and obviously on our website as well. We place media articles, and we have to work very closely with the legal professions in developing that material and making sure that it gets out to our full candidate pool, because obviously, unlike some countries, we don't have a career judiciary, so we draw from the legal professions themselves. So the diversity of those legal professions we rely on. The importance of role models is something that's been mentioned. I mean, role models we absolutely recognise can be really powerful in terms of helping to myth bust and inspire more candidates from less traditional backgrounds to apply for judicial appointment. And that's also something that I've experienced in my, in my own personal experience as a public servant as well. So we encourage successful candidates in target groups such as women to speak at outreach events, and also to feature on our website as case studies, which is one of the really the most popular features on our website. The second strand of the strategy is that we use open, transparent and fair selection processes. That's obviously at the core of what the JAC does. And we publish our selection process in advance of each exercise alongside clear competency-based criteria. We quality proof our selection materials. We use mock dry run candidates, for example, to make sure there's no discrimination or unintended bias. We have a group of independent lay panel members who are recruited by open competition, and they sit on all of our selection panels alongside a member of the judiciary. Over half of our panelists are women. And they are all trained in unconscious bias, for example. We request diversity data from candidates when they apply, and we then use that anonymously to track their progression throughout the selection process against the estimated pool of eligible candidates. And I'm pleased to say that the data, which we also publish on an annual basis, tells us that in a large majority of JAC exercises, women are doing as well as or better than men in all the various stages of the selection process. The third strand of our diversity strategy is to work with government, the judiciary and the legal profession to break down structural barriers. We carried out surveys in 2008 and again in 2013 to identify the barriers that exist to application. There's still a huge amount to do, and we do have the results from that most recent survey informed an action plan that we developed with our partners, and that is the implementation of that plan is monitored by a body called the Judicial Diversity Forum, which brings together high-level representatives from all of the bodies involved, really to make sure that we are consistently translating our commitments into practice and holding us accountable. One key barrier for women, and one which we have seen some progress on, is the availability of flexible working, which has obviously come up already. In 2013, the option of part-time working was extended across all courts up to the highest level, and our very rough estimate at the moment is that around a third of exercises include some flexible posts, and that has included several High Court exercises. In addition to those three strands, since 2014, the JAC has been able to use positive action, what's known as the equal merit provision. And that provides that where the Commission considers that two or more candidates are of equal merit, then they can select one of them for the purposes of increasing diversity. That provision on its own is not going to close the gender gap, but it gives the Commission another tool in the toolbox, and it is already starting to make a positive contribution. So in terms of the data, that shows us that the gender gap within the judiciary is narrowing, but it's slow and steady, I think, is probably how I would describe it. So women have applied for judicial appointment in significantly higher numbers since the JSA was set up 10 years ago. Over 40% of all candidates recommended for appointment in that 10-year period have been women. So in terms of, this is feeding through to the overall makeup of the judiciary, but obviously because of the turnover, it's quite slow. So in 2006, 18% of the court's judiciary were women. In 2005, 25% of the court's judiciary were women. And in tribunals, it's much higher at 44%. And in fact, the number of women in the High Court has almost trebled, and the number of women in the Court of Appeal has doubled. But again, those are from very low base, low numbers, to 23 and 8, respectively. So I think you already alluded to the fact it's not really possible to single out one or two of those measures in terms of making the difference in narrowing the gap. I think the key for the JAC, in my view, is that diversity has really been effectively mainstreamed. So it's considered in every decision, however minor, that is made within the Commission. So from where we promote our vacancies to the detailed wording of selection criteria to specific interview questions that candidates will be asked, to the working patterns that are available, and so on and so on. But what we have found is that the mainstreaming is, it's not a one-off project. You can't say that it's done and we can move on and forget about that. It needs renewed commitment at the most senior levels, and also, a kind of an evaluation of what's working, which is obviously why we're so happy to be invited to this event today.
Thank you. Many elements there that actually dovetail a lot of the elements in the recommendation, which I will ask Rolf to speak to in a minute. But j'aimerais peut-être me tourner vers Agnès pour...
And now I'm going to give the floor to Agnès, who works in the economic sector, public accounting and public finance. It's not always a preferred line of business for women. I'd like to know whether in France women are well represented or whether there's still a lot to do. And I'd like you to tell us a bit about your experience and what you have identified as possible action that can change things. Thank you very much. Yes, I am a civil servant, Ministry of Finance, which is often considered as being dominated by men, and it's also the case in France, of course. I think that very early on, I understood that women altogether had things to do. And so we set up a network in which we started lobbying specifically in the civil service. And I'd like to share with you what we could say about what we discovered. Maybe the OECD has a negative image of civil service in France. Sodexo colleague Gabriela Ramos seemed to consider that we're not doing enough. But it is true that we have started making progress since the 90s. First of all, because there have been a number of laws passed on the private sector, and it's often necessary. And furthermore, there was a very strong discussion on gender equality in executive in the executive, and this was very largely discussed elsewhere. There was also gender equality in government and in cabinets. But it seems as though nothing is really happening in civil service. And it seemed as though because there are bylaws, the things are well shared. But luckily, in 2011-2012, we were able to mainstream the possibility of integrating gender equality in all the government positions, and this law was very strict. And there are 3 legislations whereby the public sector includes its vision on gender equality. There's a legislation on public and private enterprise that's inspired on the Norwegian legislation on board representation of women. And then there's also one on the board's administration representation of women in the public sector, because this is the executive part of public policy. And then there was a 3rd law, which is a very recent one, on true equality that regards competition panels and different committee members, etc. So we did have a number of traditional barriers to overcome. You have asked us what is common to public and private leadership. I think that you could say that it's the same for everybody. The self-censorship, flexible working hours, and then the transparency of hiring at a very high level, because there are no the processes, the selection processes are not open and are often opaque, and even more than in the private sector. And obviously evaluation criteria that are unmentioned. And for the first time, a woman was appointed as ambassador to one of the 8 large embassies. And in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there was a lot of talk about the breadth of shoulders of this woman. So what we can say is that things have changed. There are about 1/3 of deans in higher education. And on last Wednesday, we appointed 3 new deans of universities, which have obviously increased the statistics enormously. There are about 16% of women ambassadors, which has really soared up in the past year because of this very deliberate policy. 11% of the prefects. This doesn't mean that we're really on track. There are new barriers that have been caused by the implementation of this law, which shows that it's not only a question of pushing for legislations. You also have to accompany and follow up on the implementation. And I think that there's still quite a bit to do in that respect.
Recommendation. There have been quite a few elements picked up by the speakers to date that are perhaps not specifically mentioned in the same language or text as in the recommendation. But I would ask you perhaps, what would you see to be the outcome of this and its application? And what are the, I know that you probably don't want to single out the 2 or 3 key elements, but what do you think are the 2 or 3 key elements that stem from this recommendation, having heard some of your fellow panelists?
Thank you very much, Michelle, and I think the way that you sort of initiated the discussion, I think, is exactly where it should start. Individual experiences from women that have not only a rich experience, but also made it into very important positions to look back also to what it is that went well, but perhaps also what didn't go well, really. I'd like to say that this work on our recommendation, in fact, really resonates extremely well with what was said here today. I'd like to really point to Tatiana Teplova, who has been leading this work in the directorate with many really with many, many consultations, with lots of discussions with people, so that we wanted to make sure that in the end the recommendation is not just a very nice declaration of principles, but also something that resonates well with people who have to work on it. And I'd like to say, in the four sort of interventions here that I have heard, I thought some of the things really stand out. And let me start with perhaps the obvious, from my point of view, is the relationship to men. I really have to say the comments that were made here, I think need probably to be said a lot of times to men, to make sure that they would change and sometimes perhaps really adjust their attitudes to what it is that women actually are offering. Because I hear that type of constructive, positive, supportive attitude. And I don't think that this is something that you can just assume to be the current attitude of many men. So that's just something that I feel myself very important. The second point is, yes, it's not a single measure. Michel, you said it in the beginning. Nobody will find the sort of the silver bullet and say, well, move from here to there easily just by changing one or two conditions. And that's why we're talking here about a whole set of tools that need to be in place. I mean, really, it's an integrated approach that we are suggesting, and not believing and not creating the illusion that the one-time issue will then produce results even over the long term. The second point that I would say what resonates very well is some sort of accountability and oversight. It's not enough. Agnes, you said it. The government nominates parity government or cabinet. But when the crisis comes, then we have to change, and then we have to adjust, and we have to... That, I think, is sort of the obvious sign that it's not enough to declare, but also to make sure that someone is held accountable, and not just in sanctioning it, but in encouraging to make good on what legislation has been made to actually happen. And the third point is, if I may say so, I'm delighted that we not only talk today about the public sector as the public administration. No? We have here a section about public employment, and that's not surprisingly, because in many countries of the OECD, public employment is a large employer. I mean, the government is a large employer, and by that it means by whatever they do in the government, it has an impact on what the results are. And I can just say, interestingly enough, when you look at the overall figure, it's about 50% of men and women in the public sector. But I'm talking about the role of the public sector in the total labor force that makes it a bit of a different actor. And second, I'd say, we have here raised the issue of public life. It's not by accident that it says on gender equality in public life, because public life doesn't end with the government in the sense of public administration. No, it has, as we just heard, implications for those that make policies, parliamentarians, ministers, prime ministers, but also those that take care of the civil society, and I have to say here very much the role of the judiciary, because the rule of the law is not something that is happening by itself, and the way it's happening depends on who and what kind of institutional framework you do it. So I think it's a very nice sort of really representative set of experiences that, not in the same language as you said, but in the spirit, is certainly captured here. If I may just add one element, but that's an impression that I have. This is a recommendation on equality in public life. And very often, I have been here listening to discussions about women in the private sector. In the private sector as being always the ones that are sort of having not the right share in key positions. I think what would be interesting to see whether in the end, and that can only come from you, whether in the end there's really a difference between private sector and public sector where the gender balance would make it sort of a special problem for the ones or the others. And I just, frankly, I doubt it, but it may well be the case. Well, I wouldn't sort of ask for an answer that maybe you want to come back in your comments. You have perhaps also had some experiences with other areas than just the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. Monica, you have had the benefit of seeing evolution in many countries, and the comparative analysis that you bring and the knowledge that you bring. If I look to Canada, women represent 39% of the graduates from STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But we certainly don't represent that in terms of the employment. We look at the wage gap. Our stats are not that lovely. We have a wage gap of about over 30% in Canada. So you've looked at what's happening in the world. Perhaps you can give us an overview of, or not an overview, but what works, what doesn't. What have you seen where progress has been made? And then, as Gabriela Ramos indicated earlier, you were instrumental in the 25 for 25, the closing of the gap. So maybe that also helped inform the 25 for 25.
Well, there's a lot of different issues there. So let me start perhaps with the STEM issue. And I think Canada is actually one of the good examples because many other countries do not have that many girls and young women going into STEM professions. And we've looked at, for those few girls in the different countries, when they actually go into those studies, then they end up working somewhere else. So many of them go through physics, mathematics, engineering, and so on. Already going through the studies is very hard because it's hard to be among a handful of women in an auditorium filled with young men. And you know, some people basically get so discouraged by being alone and having to fight against that it already takes a very strong character. Then once they've gone through all of this, many of them end up not going into industry, research, laboratories, and so on, but many of them end up going teaching, and often in schools, not in universities. Why do they do that? Because they find it easier to combine that type of schedule with family responsibilities, which are still very largely taken up by the women. And that's something that has nothing to do with public or private sector, but the family responsibilities, we are increasingly seeing that that is the single biggest lever in terms of policy which countries can act on. And that's why for this Women's Day this year, we have decided to concentrate a lot of our efforts on talking about father's leave. Now you might be saying, what does this have to do with the subject here? But if we don't get men to do more at home, to take more leave, and to help the women more at home, it's not even about helping women, it's about sharing these responsibilities, then we're just not going to move. Because we see in those countries where men actually take longer leave, they spend much more time afterwards also taking care of children and doing housework. And luckily, and this is something where data is great, we have time use data across countries. And that shows you that in many countries, women work at least as much, if not more than men, except a large share of it is unpaid. And they work more than men, even when it's the woman who's bringing home the money and the man is inactive. And then the woman gets home, and that's what the Americans call doing gender. Then she starts doing all the housework and the shopping and taking care of the kids and so on, cooking. So there's something wrong here. And if we don't correct that particular imbalance, I think we're not going to go anywhere. Now, on another point, which I'd like to pick up on what Rolf just said, because I think that is fundamental, and that was my experience looking at our colleagues' data, Tatjana and Rolf's colleagues who've been collecting all this interesting information. I have to say I was shocked to see the public sector data. Because naively, when we approached this, I thought, well, we know that the public sector is the preference for a lot of women to work in because of the more predictable work schedules, because you're not being called by your CEO in the middle of the night on the weekend. You don't have to jump on airplanes and be sent across other countries in order to promote in your career and so on. So naively, I thought, well, probably it's pretty good for women to work there. Well, lo and behold, it is not. Because when I saw the numbers of the people rising to the top, it's not that great. The one area where I do think there is a difference is on you don't have to negotiate your salary all the time, right? And yes, maybe will correct me, but at least at the lower levels, and I can tell you at the OECD, there's no way you're going to negotiate anything. So you just move up a step every year. Well, maybe we have a conversation with Michelle about that, but yes. But at least we cannot say, if I look at our own working environment, we can't really say that this is about us going out and discussing with our bosses, give me more or something, because there's no way you're going to get more. So men and women are treated the same. But when it comes to promotions, obviously, that's when things become the same as in the private sector. So, well, that's more to say, but maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you. I saw, Noor, you were nodding your head, so would you like to add to that? Yeah.
Yes, I do agree with Monica that I think that's why I encourage women to go up for the decision-making, process. Because if, like the leave for the men, this is what women are weak in. Weak, I mean that we always say, yes, it's a nurture for us to keep on, giving love to our children. And in my country, I was so shocked because one of my colleagues gave birth 11 children. I said, oh my God, and she's still working. I said that, what's happening? Because they think that she wanted to have, she told me that she wanted to have more children. I said that, are you serious? Yeah, but this is because of, everywhere. I think that still male-dominated. In politics, that they think that why women don't want to be in politics? Because they think that's dirty. It's a dirty politics. That's why I really, actually it's not, the mindset of the woman itself and the man should work together. I really appreciate the OECD who will launch this recommendation, because at least that's a man's side, that they understand that woman now is half of world population. That's now if you do not empower women, that women contribute a lot to the work economic. In Indonesia now we have more women entrepreneurship. I mean that when we are crisis, 1998, who helped us, the Indonesian economic? It's a woman. The men get leave from the office, and the woman who stand up to do the small and medium enterprises. So, but please, we can be together. We can overcome the challenge. We share. That's why I'm a mother of 4 children. And I treated them equally. So from the early birth, that's both the parents should treat them. There is no difference between boys and girls. Just let them go. Just treat them equally. This is what we should really looking at the curriculum education. We should educate both men and women equally. Do not separate because, we still have school who only belong to a man. We still have a school who only belong to girls, to boys and to girls. There should be no more. Because in this sense that they will say that, oh, male is more, male should be a leaders. Woman should be backside, should do the housework, like you said, Monica. then every woman that they voluntarily will work. Not me. Not me. I said that because my husband always said that you were doing politics when I re-elected, you know, going to challenge. I said, this is my work and this is my life. I should encourage more women. I live not only for myself but for others. Then the children, that we cannot just say that the children should be taking good care of others. No, still both men and women, husband and wife, has same responsibility. I asked him to go to school to get my children's report and whatever, that it doesn't have to be me. So we as a woman should not just receive whatever that they ask us to do. But as I mentioned before, yes, respectively, while others are very busy, then we can voluntarily do the work, but not every time. So the husband also the same. It's not every time they should do the work. When I saw my children now I have grandchildren. When my son taking care of the children, I said, good. I didn't say, oh, it's funny, you know, it's because the wife is there and doing nothing, and my son is very busy with the children, with my grandchildren. But I said, I didn't say anything, because I put it, this is a life. Then, you know, this is what we should do. I agree with you, that it should be both. And you also said that it doesn't have to be from somebody, and we should be really working together. Ask them to understand us, and we understand them, respect each other. This is what very important. I mean, my country is very difficult, actually, Michelle, because we are 360 ethnics. Can you imagine? That different languages, different. But then the culture, it's still difficult. It's religion norms, it's also still become a burden. But how I go through this challenge, because I just tell them that I'm doing the right thing. I'm not doing something wrong. I'm doing a good things, not only for me. This is what we should tell them. As long as you have convinced yourself that you're doing the right things, so go ahead. When people believe opportunity only comes once, I do not believe so. For me, we can create opportunity. We can create opportunity at any time. So this is very important, because when you have opportunity in 1998, when Suharto fell, all my friends told me, Nur, please come, join the political party. Come, come. I was in business. And I said, no, no, no. It's opportunity, you know, it's only comes once. I said, okay, fine, go ahead. And then I saw my friends sitting in the house as the MPs. For me, no, I wait until 2003. They said that no more. I said that, okay, I will be there, don't worry, not now. And I plan, and I work on my plan. And then in 2003, 2004, I was in election, I elected. And all my friends who were running at that time, and they didn't get any more seats, so they lost. I mean that this is what we should do. And when I asked to be in one political party, I said, no, 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 no. I should see what's fit on me. So I was doing a window shopping. I didn't go to any political party that they want me to be. But I'm the one who decide which political party that suit on me and will give me opportunity to go as higher as we can. So this is really what we should do. Women should not just take whatever the opportunity they give, but we also can decide which direction we want to go, and make sure that you are convincing that you are there, you do the right things, and take other women, take other men to be with you. this is what my comment.
Thank you. Lot of really important elements in all of your statements, but I would want to turn to a question, which is, we talked about outcomes. How do you achieve change, and how do you see change happen? But I would ask, from your perspective, we've talked about role models, critical mass, quotas, legislation. Your perspective, Martine.
Well, I am convinced that quotas and legislations are crucial, of course, but they are not enough. And I've repeated it many a time. What is really important is to change mindsets. We must change the mindsets of young boys so that from a very young age they respect girls in schools, to show them that boys and girls are equal, that we can learn from one another. I've learned a lot from other people. I was in fact a teacher in a school where there were only boys. I was a teacher of philosophy, and I taught philosophy to young men, and having only men in the room completely changes the way you think and see things. So they must understand that we can really learn from other people, people who think differently, people who have a different perspective. So this is why I also believe that Europe needs to hear the voice of women. And I think that a lot more would change if the voice of women was heard. And I totally agree with you. I think that what's important, you know, in the public sector, the most important thing is power. In the private sector, it's money. And it seems to be that power really is the most important thing in the public sector. And when you said that you entered politics because you wanted to help other people, because you had a number of political convictions, this is something that I've heard many times from women. And when women decide to go into politics, it's not because they want to be a pioneer, not because they want to have a power, it's just because they feel that they need to do something, and they want to knuckle down and change things. There's something that I found very surprising, is that women apply much less than men for key positions in companies. So it's not just a question of quota of legislation, it's just that they don't even dare apply for these key positions. And then finally, on the pay gap in the public and private sector, women will only accept to move up in the company, but will never move further, so as to never make more money than their husband or their partner. And that means quite a lot, really, that there is still this necessity, this need from men to be the main breadwinner. And as a consequence, that's why women continue doing chores at home, etc., as you mentioned earlier.
I don't disagree with anything that's just been said. I mean, legislation, I think, is essential. To have a statutory framework is absolutely essential, but it's obviously just a bare minimum, I think. It's very interesting. I mean, cultural change, I think, can ebb and flow. I was just reflecting when you were talking about flexible working. When I was a baby, however many years ago, my father shared the childcare with my mother so that she could study at university. And I knew that that wasn't normal when I was growing up. I knew that it wasn't the norm when I was growing up, but I thought that that was totally within the norm. And it's very frustrating to be, however many years later, having a conversation about, another conversation yet again, about whether we can accommodate that and whether men should be sharing the childcare, for example. I think that for example, in the civil service in the UK, I think some progress has been made, and not talking about the judiciary, just the civil service and public service as a whole. And I think that we have very good, I would say, people-friendly rather than family-friendly policies in place in terms of flexible working. And I think it's really important, firstly, that we have the policies in place and that they're open to all and they're promoted for all sorts of benefits, and men clearly and very visibly are using them too. And that's another thing, I think, that has worked in the wider civil service in the UK, has been having diversity champions from across the spectrum, if you like. So men being diversity champions for gender diversity and that kind of thing. And that is something that is starting to be done in the judiciary. And I think that hopefully that will start to have an impact. I think, sorry, just one last thing. I think once men are in a position where they can actually genuinely promote the benefits of those policies, I think that's what perhaps shifts the balance.
Oui, bien évidemment, il faut avoir.
Of course, we need to have a whole range of policies, as Rolf said earlier. We need to have a good policy mix. In the French law, we also have a lot of financial sanctions, which fueled many debates between the ministries before the law was adopted in 2012. But that's not enough, and there's sometimes some double-edged swords. And in France, in the public sector, it was no one ever talked about the pay gap. Today, there's still 9 to 10% gap in wages in the public sector, which is quite close to the figures in the private sector. And there's some provisions also in the law that don't work out as they were designed. For example, there were a lot of women that were appointed for the first time at a number of key positions. And very often the next person is not a woman, it's another man who take their place. And this is something that the law had not taken into account. And all of this must be quite boring for men too, because we talk about these issues repeatedly. We talk a lot about it in Parliament, and as many said today, men must be our allies. So I think that we must really draw on what the women's networks are doing in France to better understand the service provided by the state. So there is a link between women in the public sector and the modernization of that same public service. And there's also a need for more transparency and a need for more accountability, and the public sector must be a role model. So we need to modernize the public service by bringing in more women. Basing your human resources on skills, of course, is something that can help women get into the public service. Rather than having last-minute appointments, to have a more organized transition system is also something that can help women. This is something that some countries are doing, even though in France it is still early days. And finally, one last issue. gender parity has an impact on the performance of companies. Many studies were carried out in the private sector. It's difficult to carry out the same kind of study in the public sector, but it is quite clear that when everybody can speak out and can know that there are in equal numbers men and women, then things can change. You can cooperate more. You can think about concrete questions without being scared of what other people might think in the room. So you can really talk about everything and anything and really fuel the debate and enrich the debate about public policy and at the end of the day make better decisions. So I think it's really important to think about modernizing the public service. A lot of women's ministerial networks were set up in France over the last few years, probably drawing from what was done in North America, and we are all trying to get together in networks to forge ahead on how to modernize the public sector.
Would you like to add to that?
Thank you very much. If I just could continue with these ideas that Agnès presented. I think it really is really in the same way that I think we have another chance of going at it from a different perspective. And I think there are those two things that you mentioned, Agnès. The first one is, now here we have in the organization a very strong emphasis these days on inclusion. And I mean inclusion means that there is diversity that you have to bring on board. It has many dimensions, no doubt about it. But I think that this is a very positive approach to say perhaps one of the most visible exclusions that are still taking place should be addressed in the concept of bringing everybody on board. That's a very important issue, not just in terms of, as it sort of started out, the discussion about income, which we could translate into salaries. That's certainly a very important part. But there are very different ideas about inclusion that go way beyond the question of income. It's a lot about opportunity and being able to realize an opportunity. So I think the debate, if we could put this into a context of inclusion, at least I think it would probably create a few more allies, simply because more people think that it is necessary to be brought into public policy and into public life. And the other sort of angle that I see is your reference to modernization. I really think that we have here a strong movement to making sure that modernization, again, serves modernization of public administration in particular, serves a lot of objectives. And it is certainly one of them is efficiency. You spoke about this. But I would like to add one where we're saying it's also about competence, and it is about the best way to serve citizens. How could we not talk about a workforce that brings these qualities on board? And I think here to talk about a civil service that meets standards that are really way beyond the issue of efficiency would help again to mobilize the debate. But one thing is also, and I thought it was wonderful what you said, Monica, there remains the need for evidence. Data and following up on data and bringing them again and again into the discussion is just a fact to make sure that the debate doesn't sort of get astray. And therefore, in our recommendation, we have put really a lot of emphasis, not just only on thinking about do we collect and do we know the right data, but also to make sure that those who make policies think about really immediately about these impact assessments. out of the perspective, for example, for gender. What does actually the current legislation on various things, not just if it is a question of women, but the question is, what does spending in a certain way actually mean? What is the impact on gender, whether it's education or whether it's health? So I would stay tuned to think about, make sure we get support for data collection and making sure that we present pictures and these snapshots, if you like, as it was said today, that they are repeated. Because in the end, I think they will probably change a bit the minds of people to think about the same issue just because, didn't I know? Now I know. Now I have to do something about it. Thank you.
One of the elements I think that you raised, Monica, and Rolf, you're picking up, and colleagues as well, is on the, is there a difference in the public and private sectors? And we would have expected, perhaps, Monica, you indicated a better performance in the public sector. I think we have a better numbers performance in the public sector. Have we achieved cultural change in terms of how people, how managers, how elected officials understand and act? I would say partly. There's a lot of work to do, but I would say there are a couple of elements which, to pick up on the recommendation. I think the individual leader is important, but I think you also need clear outcomes from an individual leader. You as a leader, and I think, Noor, you said that you went in because you wanted to do something. I headed organizations not just because I wanted to achieve outcomes in the organizations, but I also wanted to affect change. But you also need the institutional framework. You need the data. So this is why I think many of us have said quotas, yes, legislation, yes, but if it can't be on its own. If the institutional framework, if the support mechanisms aren't there, if the transparency in the hiring, if the education system doesn't necessarily lead you to, so there's no single element, but from a public sector perspective, you also need an institutional framework and an institutional set of measures. You also need to measure and report. You need the data, you need the analysis, you need to be able to show that while we can't always measure public sector productivity, you can measure public sector effectiveness and how the representativity or representativeness actually helps you in reaching out to your citizens, the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I also think what many of you have pointed out is the communications. And to be able to communicate the benefits, but also to communicate and reinforce on a regular basis the importance of the diverse workforce, the importance of the different voices. And that comes back to the leadership. And I think if you don't have the leaders in place, it's even with all of those elements, it's going to be very difficult. What that doesn't affect, to go back to your point, Monica, is what happens in the home yet. But the discussion around the management table and the fact that if you can have a balanced representation and different voices, those issues do come up. I know, I've heard them. And that does have an influence, but it's not the total impact. The public sector as a whole, education, child benefits, daycare, all of that does. But how do you, maybe I'll leave you with the most difficult question, how do you affect that change?
Now, that is actually, for me, the next frontier, really, because I've been fascinated. I myself, I'm German, and my country is not exactly known for being very gender progressive, because women are still frowned upon if they're mothers and they go out for work. So I looked at data again, and I found something absolutely stunning. I looked at the attitudes of people, and you can see about 20% of Germans in 2012 thought that the mother of an under school-aged child before 6 should stay at home. And I thought, oh my God, look at the Germans, terrible. And I looked at the French data. It's the same proportion. But what happens is that French women, when they have a child, 62% of French women work full-time even if they have a child. 26% of German women work full-time when they have a child. So that to me shows you might have attitudes, but you also need this infrastructure. And that to me was the biggest proof to look at these two And the other point, and this is, I mean, will not surprise you coming from the OECD, money. Money is a very powerful argument. So, for example, I always wanted to know how did the Nordic countries, how did Sweden become Sweden? How did Iceland, the big gender champion, become Iceland? In the 50s and 60s, they had a positive 50% tax credit for the second earner income, which was women. That is a lot of money. And how did we get the G20 argument? Money. Because we saw a clear change also in our discussions in our working party. For years we had a couple of, and I won't name them all, but a bunch of very conservative countries who didn't really want to talk about family policy and gender, and no, we don't want to do this, and concentrate on other things, do pensions, please, and so on. Yeah. After a while, they realized that they couldn't really do pensions anymore because they were aging and aging rapidly. And suddenly we had those same countries around the table who all said, could you please do more on family, on fertility, on how do we get those fertility rates up? Why are Swedish and French women having babies while German, Japanese, and Korean women are not having babies? So again, the economic argument is powerful. And why did the G20 leaders adopt that argument? Because they see it as the increased labor force participation of women as a good and important contribution to strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. So we need a combination, but let's not underestimate the force of economic arguments.
I think that's actually not a bad place on which to end, given the OECD, given the impact that we can have. So I want to thank you all for this. Yes.
Yeah, because I would ask OECD, to encourage donor country. I mean that because of the financial difficulty for women to get into the decision-making process, then to have special women bonds for women to run in the politics, because we need that. I mean, to encourage women to get more position in decision-making process. Thank you.
That's not a bad one to end on, too. Green bonds, women bonds. From a public sector perspective, that's not a bad investment. Thank you all for your contributions. Merci beaucoup de vos interventions.
I think that the discussion will continue between our panelists and the audience. Since
Merci. Merci.